Hi, I'm Inez. I had just started my adult life when this whole story started. Right after college, I got my first real job in marketing and finally moved into my own apartment. Nothing special, just a small studio apartment with questionable water pressure and a cranky radiator. But she was mine, and that was her main value. My family was traditional, as they like to say. I have an older brother, Gaspard, who is 29, married to Sarah, and they have two children. Mom and Dad still live in the same house where we grew up. Every Saturday we gather there for dinner, an inviolable ritual that we started as children. Another Saturday night went on as usual. Dad beamed with pride as he handed over the mashed potatoes and announced with his usual solemnity that Gaspard had completed his third major deal of the quarter. Mom immediately picked it up, breaking into an admiring smile. I always knew he had a talent for it. Then her attention shifted to Sarah. "Honey, this dress is amazing. You always know what to wear." She was looking at my brother's wife with an expression that seemed to be looking only at her. Sarah replied with a smile, and I continued to move the food around the plate without looking up. I felt like a random prop on the stage of a long-rehearsed play. Dad admired Gaspard's achievements, Mom admired Sarah, and the kids ran around without bothering anyone. I was already used to these dinners and to the looks that Sarah gave me, appreciative, condescending, as if I had come here in a garbage bag instead of a dress. It seemed to me that compared to her, I was always something incomplete, imperfect. But something went wrong that night. The house smelled hot, the children were surprisingly calm, and the conversation about Gaspard's professional successes had just died down when Mom and Dad exchanged meaningful glances. Dad cleared his throat and looked at Mom as if he was waiting for her approval. "We have an important announcement," he finally said. Mom nervously smoothed out her napkin. "We've finally made a will," she said in the same tone she always pretended to be reasonable. At that moment, I froze. The fork froze halfway to his mouth. Sarah sat up straight in her chair, and Gaspard froze in the middle of taking a sip of water. "We've been thinking for a long time," Dad continued. "And we decided to leave everything to Gaspard. The house, cottage on the lake, all their savings." I sat staring at my plate and tried to make sense of what I had heard. "Gaspard has two children to think about," Mom said in a flat, slightly detached tone, as if explaining an indisputable truth. "They need a stable foundation for the future." I found my voice somewhere between shock and pain. What about my future? The words were quieter than I'd intended, but they seemed to echo throughout the dining room anyway. "I'm going to have my own family, too." I looked directly at my mother, but her eyes remained cold and glassy. "You know I'm going to have kids someday." Mom's face made the expression I've known since childhood, slightly strained eyes, slightly lowered lips, a mask of condescending disappointment. "Inez, dear," her voice was honey-like, but too smooth, like a learned line, "this decision is final. Your father and I will not change the will." That's when it hit me. A tidal wave of memories crashed into my head, drowning me in years of awareness. It wasn't about Gaspard's children. I've never had any children, family names, or any debt to the future generation. It was because of Gaspard. It was always because of Gaspard. Suddenly, I was 8 years old again. I was sitting in the school auditorium, my little fingers trembling over the piano keys. I looked into the auditorium, but 2 seats in the parents' section were empty. Because Gaspard had a football match that day. I was 12. I kept a report card with excellent grades, sitting at the dinner table, waiting for praise, but instead I heard Mom and Dad admiring his B+ in chemistry. He tried so hard. 15. I cried in my room after the first breakup, but Mom was downstairs helping Gaspard choose the perfect corsage for his girlfriend. 16. I won the school essay contest, but no one came to the ceremony because Gaspard was graduating that day. 18. I was giving a valedictory speech to the graduates, but my parents were late and left early. Gaspard needed help with moving. All these moments connected like dots, forming a picture that I didn't want to see. I looked at my mother, at her serene, confident expression, at my father, who silently supported her decision, and the words came out of my mouth. You always loved him more than you loved me. Silence, thick as heavy velvet, covered the table. Even the children stopped fidgeting, and their dessert spoons froze in the air. It's not about his children. Not about his future. It's about how you choose your beloved child again. Mom's face paled. Inez, this is ridiculous. Her voice became firmer. We love both of our children equally. When? I asked. When have you ever chosen me over him? Silence. My parents looked at each other, as if trying to remember at least one moment, but I knew they couldn't. There were none. Name at least one case, I repeated, feeling an icy emptiness spreading inside. Silence. I pushed the chair back, and its legs scraped loudly on the floor. I will no longer pretend that we are an ideal family where everyone is loved equally. I won't try to earn your attention anymore. My voice was trembling, but inside everything was strangely clear and calm. Don't expect me to come to family dinners. Don't expect me to continue playing the role of the grateful second-best child. Mom's face turned red, and her lips twitched with indignation. You're being selfish, Inez, she snapped. All you care about is money. I clenched my fists. It's not about the money. My voice became low and strained. It's about respect. I looked at her, seeing not my mother in front of me, but a woman who had never really tried to get to know me. You've made it clear that you don't consider me an equal. You expect me to come, smile, pretend that everything is fine. I looked at Gaspard. He sat in awkward silence, staring at his plate as if trying to find answers in it. But they weren't there. But the past is a stubborn thing. It doesn't just lie on the bottom of memory like sediment. It doesn't settle quietly, allowing you to move on. It knows how to wait. It returns suddenly, with a bell that breaks the silence. I was just going upstairs, holding the hands of my twins. They were laughing, humming something, and I thought it would be an ordinary evening, a bath, fairy tales, a dream. But as soon as the phone vibrated in my pocket, something changed in the air. I looked at the screen. Gaspard. 2 years. 2 long years, and here he is. I stared at that name, at the numbers marking the time gap between us. Then, before I could change my mind, I clicked on reply. Inez, Gaspard's voice was low, strained. I need to talk to you. I felt my stomach tighten. Gaspard, I'm not sure that. It's not about the past, he interrupted. It's about Mom. My heart started beating faster. What's wrong with her? She's in the hospital. Stroke. I closed my eyes. 2 voices were fighting inside me. One, cold and hard, reminded me how hard I was trying to cut her out of my life. The other, softer, said that, no matter what, she was my mother. Inez? Gaspard sounded tired. I took a deep breath. Which hospital? When I entered the room, the first thing that caught my eye was how much my mother had changed. She seemed smaller, weaker. Her eyes, which had always looked at me with a slight hint of condescension, now looked different. You came. Her voice was weak, barely audible. I stood on the threshold, not knowing what to say. Gaspard called me, I replied simply. She nodded, as if she knew that was exactly what was going to happen. There was silence. I was trying to figure out how I felt. Anger? Pity? All at once? How are you? I finally asked. The doctors say that the chances are good. She looked down at her hands. But this, it got me thinking. About a lot of things. I was silent. About you, she continued. About how I behaved. About how things turned out. I looked up. I wasn't always right, Inez. She had never said such words. Are you really aware of this, or are you just afraid to die? I asked quietly. She flinched, but did not turn away. Maybe, both, she admitted. I didn't know what to say. Gaspard entered the room, his gaze darted between us. Inez, he said carefully, I think Mom wants to fix what she can. I looked at him. Is that possible? Mom closed her eyes. I don't expect you to forgive me right away, she whispered. But I want to try. I sighed. I do not know if I can. She nodded, as if she had expected this answer. But I saw hope in her eyes. The past does not disappear. It's waiting for the moment to knock again. And sometimes we open the door. I stood in the doorway, gripping the jamb tightly, trying to stay afloat amid all the pain that overwhelmed me when I heard those words. A real family. These two people, who were once my parents, now stood in front of me and tried to erase 10 years of their lives, as if it were a poorly drawn sketch. The children they carried in their arms, taught to ride a bike, took to school, now suddenly ceased to exist. I could hear my own children laughing behind my back, joking, unaware that something fundamental was crumbling behind that door right now. How can you say that? My voice sounded hoarse, almost a whisper, but every note was filled with rage. How can you just cross them out? They haven't stopped being children. They didn't change. They are still the same boy and girl you loved. Mom sobbed, her shoulders were shaking, but I could see something ugly in her eyes. Something that repelled me. Inez, you don't understand. No, you don't understand. I snapped. You don't care who you love. You needed something perfect, something admirable, something to show off to your friends, something to be proud of. You've never needed the people themselves, only their status. They both froze. I looked at my father. He was silent, his face tense, as if he was counting every word before saying it. These kids, he finally said. They're not part of our family. I asked, coldly, expectantly. Am I part of your family? Mom screamed as if I'd hit her. Of course, you are our daughter. But not when you had Gaspard. Then I was unnecessary. The second number. Now that he's infertile, now that his family isn't as perfect as you thought, do you suddenly think of me? They didn't say anything. I exhaled slowly, stepping back, creating more space between us. Go away. Mom blinked in disbelief. Inez, you can't. I can. And I do. Go away. We just want to get to know our grandchildren. No, I said. You want to replace those you lost. You don't want to know my children, you want to fill the void. But they are not a backup option. They won't be a consolation prize. Mom sobbed even louder, but I couldn't see the sincerity in it anymore. Dad stood motionless, his face was red, his eyes were burning with something like anger. You're making a terrible mistake, Inez, he said, his voice low and threatening. You're denying us a family. I looked straight into his eyes. No, I said calmly. I'm just finally choosing myself. And with that, I closed the door. There was movement behind her, muffled voices, and Mom was saying something, but I wasn't listening anymore. I pressed my back against the door, a storm raging in my chest, my head throbbing. I did it. I've made a point. Mom? My daughter's voice rang out. I opened my eyes. The children were standing in the doorway of the living room, their small faces looking at me curiously. Who was that? I straightened up, wiped a stray tear from my cheek, and smiled at them. No one important, I replied. Because, perhaps for the first time in his entire life, it was actually true. I was sitting at the table, clutching my phone in my hands, while an invisible weight hung in the air, as if something was bursting inside. The sudden offer, the opportunity to regain what was lost, hummed like a shadow, moving slowly across the room. All these words, like pieces of a broken mirror, were reflected in my head and could not find a way out. I wasn't ready to hear them. I was not ready to allow myself to return to those persuasions and manipulations that are so familiar. You were right about all this before. We'll fix everything. Just let us be the grandparents of your children. These words were spinning in my head, ringing like a blade in the open air. My eyes never left the screen. I read them over and over again, trying to figure out what to do with this unexpected prospect. I felt a storm growing in my chest. They thought it was all their last trump card, their way to re-enter my life, to make me part of their plan. But their offer could not erase decades of painful memories, could not dissolve all those resentments that I carried within me as a heavy burden. I rejected the phone, throwing it on the table, and stood up, as if my body suddenly demanded action. Once at the window, I looked out at the street where the children were playing, laughing happily, and felt my hand clench into a fist. They didn't understand, they couldn't understand. How could they think that the mere threat of money, property, and right decisions would restore what had been destroyed by their actions? Jacob entered the room, putting his bag on the table and wiping his hands on his jeans. His gaze immediately became serious, noticing my tension. Is everything okay? What is it? He asked quietly, not demanding an answer, but only waiting for me to share what was bothering me. I nodded, but it was more to reassure him than because the situation was really okay. He came closer, sat down next to me and took my hand. You don't have to go through all this alone, he said with gentle urgency. You did the right thing, Inez. You told them no, and it was the right decision. I was silent. The words wouldn't come. I just wanted to lose myself in this moment, forget about their calls and texts, hide myself from the world. But I couldn't. The old feeling of helplessness when I sat at that table and watched their manipulations came over me again. What if, I started, but Jacob put his finger on my lips, not allowing me to continue. No. You shouldn't even think about it. We cannot afford to believe that they will change. This has all gone too far for their promises to have any weight. They tried to control you and your family, and now that you refuse their terms, they're trying to manipulate your feelings. I took a deep breath, shifting my gaze to his face, in which I found so much confidence and support. Sometimes his calmness was the only thing I could accept as the truth in a world full of lies and betrayal. You're right, I finally said, feeling the tension gradually drain away. But sometimes I feel like I should have done something differently. Feel sorry for them. Let them see the children. Maybe that would be more correct. It wouldn't be more correct, he replied confidently. That would be more dangerous. You think that they will change, that something will be different if you open the door. But they'll take everything away from you again. You deserve better. His words penetrated deep into my heart, filling it with light, pulling me out of the darkness into which I had almost returned. I looked at him and felt incredibly grateful for his support. At that moment, I realized that we don't have to agree to terms that other people dictate. We are us. And our children are our real family. That evening, as we sat at the table, despite all the challenges and trials, I felt real peace in my life for the first time. My children, Jacob, our house, that was what was important. Not these empty promises. Not their gifts. Not their attempts to interfere in our lives again. I couldn't let them destroy the world we had built. Gaspard looked up at me, his eyes filled with fatigue mixed with something else: bitterness, disappointment, pain. I asked her about it, he repeated, his voice flat, but there was a hidden tremor in it. She just said, "There's no point in lying." I felt something constrict inside me. A lie? I asked, shaking my head in disbelief. Yes, he grinned, but there was no joy in that grin. Can you imagine? 10 years is a lie. The love they showered on my children is a lie. Everything I built, everything I was to them, turned out to be unimportant. Not something that deserves to be preserved. I looked at him, at his slumped shoulders, at the shadows under his eyes, and for the first time in a long time I felt something like sympathy for him. They did to you what they did to me," I whispered, finally finding the strength to say it out loud. Gaspard nodded, but his face remained tense. "I never thought I'd be in your shoes. I was sure that I had nothing to worry about, that I would always be right for them. The way they wanted me to be." I remembered how he sat at the very table where I once felt like a ghost. I remembered how my mom was glowing with pride for him, and how my dad was passing him mashed potatoes with satisfaction, as if it were a symbol of approval. "I was a fool, Inez," he continued, looking away. "I was blind. And I'm sorry. I'm sorry." Those words struck a chord in me. I didn't know if it was possible to forgive everything so easily. But I could see that he was sincere. And I suddenly felt sorry for him. We were silent. I watched as he clutched his cup, as his shoulders hunched slightly, as for a moment he looked lost. "What are you going to do now?" I asked. He sighed and rubbed his face with his palms. "I don't know. To rebuild my life, probably. To find meaning in something else. In something real." I looked at my reflection in his dim eyes and realized that, despite everything, we were closer than ever. We both lost our parents. Only they were still alive. "You know," I set my cup aside, "you don't have to do this alone." He looked up at me. "You mean?" "I mean, we have a chance to do something better than what they did." He nodded slowly, as if realizing the meaning of my words. "Maybe we should start with another cup of coffee." "What is it?" he asked, a faint smile touching his lips. "Maybe," I replied, feeling for the first time in a long time that maybe we could build something of our own. Present. Weeks passed, then months. Life moved forward like a river, without looking back at the obstacles that were left behind. I no longer waited for letters. I no longer checked my phone, not thinking that there might be a new message from my parents. All of this became the past, obscured by a thick fog that dissipated with each new morning. Gaspard appeared in my life as suddenly as my parents disappeared. At first it was casual correspondence, rare meetings for a cup of coffee. But over time, he began to come to our house, at first awkwardly, with caution, as if he was afraid that his presence would destroy what I had built. But my children didn't know the past. They didn't see the walls that once separated us. They didn't know what it was like in another era. To them, he was just Uncle Gaspard, a man who came with a story and sweets, with attention and patience. I looked at him as he sat on the living room carpet, letting the twins make a crown of colorful hairpins on his head. He was no longer the immaculately pressed and polished Gaspard of my memories. He was no longer trying to meet other people's expectations. He was no longer chasing the perfection that was required of him. He just was. One day, when the children were asleep and we were left in the kitchen with cups of tea, he suddenly said, "They've been trying to contact me." I knew immediately who he was talking about. "What did they say?" Gaspard took a slow sip, looked down into the cup, as if he could find the right words in its depths. "The usual stuff. That they miss you. That it's hard for them. That they want to see me, talk to me." He set the cup down on the table and rubbed his face with the palm of his hand. I think that at some point I would have believed them. Earlier, I didn't say anything, letting him continue. But now, I just know it's all a lie. They don't want me, Inez. They want an image that can be restored. A fragile shell of a family that can be flaunted to hide the cracks. I understood what he was talking about. Did you answer them? He shook his head. No. I nodded slowly. Do you think they'll ever understand? Gaspard chuckled, but there was more weariness in that grin than real amusement. I don't know. Maybe someday. But I'm not looking forward to it anymore. I looked at him. You've changed. He chuckled. Well, I had to. And at that moment, I realized that I really see him for who he is. Not the boy our parents put on a pedestal, not their golden child, but a man who survived his fall and found himself in its ruins. We were no longer strangers to each other. We became a family. The real one. Write a comment on what you think about this story and don't forget to subscribe to the channel and like it. See you soon.